All right, so what we're going to be talking about today is just wrapping up our study of interest groups. And the first thing I wanted to mention to you or remind you about is iron triangles. Now, for right now, this is a really complex diagram, but you don't need to know all these details yet because we haven't learned about the bureaucracy or Congress yet. So for right now, here's what you need to know. You need to know that iron triangles are made up of three pieces, that those three pieces are interest groups, bureaucratic agencies, and congressional committees. And then you want to be able to explain what role the interest groups play in the iron triangle. You don't need to know so much yet about what the other groups play because we haven't learned about them yet. So to begin with, interest groups have a lot of influence on those congressional committees because of lobbying, right? So interest groups are going to lobby Congress. They're going to try to get legislators to see their way. And what are some other things they can do? How else might they provide some support to those congressional committees? So remember, what's on the board you could print at any time. What we're talking about right now is thinking of ways that Congress could support congressional committees. So obviously they can lobby, just try to convince them. What else can they do that would be of a service? Okay, so they might do electioneering to influence those congressional committees, because if I don't like how the congressional committee is acting, I could try to get new people elected. So I could do that. You're not wrong. That was not what I was looking for, though. How else can interest groups support the committees, help them? Okay, they can do their homework for them, so they can provide summaries of legislation. They can also testify before the committees, right? Remember, are most congressmen experts? No, they don't. They're not civil engineers or, environmental scientists or whatever. They don't know all these details. And so interest groups can really provide an important service for Congress when they come before the committees, really to just explain it, And so that can be really helpful. In return, we would expect that congressional committees might try to pass laws that the interest groups like. But interest groups can also influence the bureaucracy. We don't think about this as often, but remember, interest groups, what is their method? They influence people in government. So most often they're trying to influence legislators, but they can also try to influence the bureaucracy. So if I'm the Sierra Club and I like what the EPA is doing, I think they're doing a great job at enforcing whatever pollution controls, then I might support the EPA by lobbying Congress on their behalf. Hey, Congress, you should raise the funding of the EPA. Hey, Congress, you should confirm this new person to the EPA because we like them. I can do that for the bureaucratic agency. On the other hand, if I'm the Sierra Club and I'm looking at today's EPA, which is reducing regulations across the board, which is sort of good for business but not particularly good for the environment maybe, then I might want to lobby against the agency, right? So then I would lobby Congress, hey, you need to cut the EPA's funding, or you need to pass a new law to strengthen the rules so the EPA has to do what they're supposed to do, or whatever it is. So you can see that interest groups, the effort of lobbying, can affect not only the legislature itself, but also the bureaucracy. Now, this is just one model of how government works, but there's another way to look at it. And so what are those called? We could have iron triangles, but yeah, we can think about issue networks. And what's the biggest difference between iron triangles and issue networks? Well, iron triangles could include more than one interest group, so that's not the biggest difference. Although you're right that in issue networks we tend to see lots of interests at play. Who's missing? What's the giant glaring omission from an iron triangle? Us, right? The people. This is about policy making and the people aren't on the chart. That seems a little bit problematic, So issue networks is a different way to look at the policy making process that gives a role for the people. But you guys, it's not an either or. There's not a right answer, is it iron triangles or is it issue networks? The answer is that it's a little bit of both. Because in some cases, the people will have a bigger role, right? When it's a really public issue, when the people are when the media is reporting about the issue and the people have a lot of information. In these cases, the public is going to have a bigger say. They're going to be calling their congressmen. They're going to be going to meetings, all this business. But at other times, there really isn't a role for the people. And really, it is pretty exclusive. The government itself is kind of dealing with itself. If you think about, rules for oil and gas refineries, how they have to operate. I mean, there might be a few, environmental interest groups that would care about that or, would be thinking about that. But for the most part, are you interested in, the specific rules for how oil and gas refineries operate? Some of you, maybe. Probably not, right? So when we're talking about policy related to the regulation of refineries, probably the people don't have much of a role there. There's not a huge public interest in that cause. So there, it's going to act more like a sub-government, like an iron triangle, where there's really this closed network of people, the refineries themselves, the legislators who are regulating them, and the bureaucracy who's in charge of monitoring it all, that are making all the decisions together. But when it's a more public issue, when people are involved thinking about something like healthcare, right, or the question of gun control, where the people are really involved, they're talking about it a lot, they're communicating with their legislators, then in these cases it's going to work more like an issue network, where there's a much broader spectrum of voices that are being heard to influence those policies, right? So that's kind of, it's not one or the other. Issue networks and iron triangles are really just different options that have to do with the political climate at the time. So I want to sort of change tactics a little bit and ask you to think about, when do you think interest groups have the most influence? What kinds of issues do you think, and we've already kind of hinted at it, at least one piece, what kinds of issues do you think give interest groups the most influence? Okay, if it's not publicized, right? So when there's an issue that doesn't get a lot of press, that isn't really on the media's agenda, those are places the interest groups can have a lot of power, right? Think about it. If it's a big public issue that everyone's talking about, and an interest group asked a congressman to vote a certain way that was not what the public wanted, and the congressman voted that way, how would that look? Awful, right? They would probably lose their seat. People would be really upset about it. They would go on about corruption. That would be really bad. On the other hand, if nobody's paying attention, and my constituents really don't care, and you're an interest group and you come to me and you offer, to contribute to my campaign for re-election next year to vote on this particular bill, and I do what you say, if no one's watching, I'm not going to really be hurt for it, right? So issues that have low public profile, that gives interest groups a lot of power. That's why if we want to talk about elite theory or even pluralism or hyperpluralism, interest groups are controlling our government right now, the biggest reason to say yes, that's true, is political apathy. When the public pays attention, interest groups don't have that much power. But when we're not paying attention, they have lots of power because legislators don't have to worry about the ramifications. What are some other examples of times that interest groups have a lot of power? Well, think about the oil and gas bill. Yeah, so when the legislation is very narrow, if we're talking about a small change or something that's going to affect only a tiny group of people, relatively speaking, then kind of for the same reason as low publicity, interest groups are going to have more influence here. Legislators don't have to worry about a huge backlash of people no matter how they vote, because it doesn't really affect that many people in the first place. So there's one good example. There's one more time that interest groups have a lot of power. We talked about if it's a very focused, isolated law, narrowly tailored, or we've talked about if there's not a lot of publicity. Think about the healthcare law. In some respects, the healthcare law, it didn't give interest groups a lot of say because it was so widely publicized. But in other respects, the actual details of the law were heavily influenced by interest groups. Can you think of why? Right? When legislation is very technical, then interest groups get more power because they're the experts, right? You and I know, that we want some kind of healthcare reform, or that we want insurance rates to go down, or whatever. We know that much. But if you start talking to me about premium caps and pre-existing conditions and the rules for the way insurers can cover or group ailments, or how generic drugs have to be tested and accepted, I don't know anything about that, right? I barely get through ordering my own insurance each year. So as a result, even though the public was really interested in the bill, and we had a lot of influence in terms of whether or not it passed, right? Broad public support for some kind of healthcare reform helped make it pass. But the actual details of the bill were heavily influenced by interest groups because they had the expertise. So when it's a very technical bill, that gives interest groups the most power. Okay, so we talked about when interest groups have the most power. Now let's switch gears and think about when interest groups have the least power. And I'm asking now for more of a type of interest group. What's a kind of interest group that wouldn't have much power? Especially if we're thinking about traditional lobbying. Yeah, I'm going to just sort of rephrase what you said, but you're exactly right. That any issue that we would consider a minority issue, and I don't mean minority in the sense that it is racial, although it can also be for a racial minority, but any interest that only represents a small amount of people, a minority of the people in the country or in the district or in the whatever, those interest groups are going to have a really hard time being successful lobbying. Why? Yeah, well, and if I'm a congressman and here you come with this small issue that only affects a few people and you're asking me to do something about it, unless I happen to be really well funded, right? Remember, if it's a small issue, then I might have a lot of power, but only if I can convince a legislator. But if I don't have a lot of money or I'm not particularly persuasive, why would the legislator listen to me? What can I threaten them with? Nothing. If I represent a small interest, a minority interest, unless that particular legislator happens to live in like a majority-minority district, like speaking racially, then there's nothing that they have to worry about. They're not going to lose an election because I don't support them. So as a result, if you represent one of those small interests, let's think about a racial minority. Maybe you represent, I don't know, Latin American immigrants or something. Then what do? If lobbying's not really going to help, they've been lobbying Congress to make immigration reform for a long time. If that's not going to help, then what do you do? Okay, great. One great example, a thing that interest groups often engage in, and this is mostly done by small interest groups, but here's some examples of bigger interest groups. You can try to shape the public's opinion, right? Like even if my interest group is a fairly small number of people, if I can get the public on my side, like if I can get everybody else on my side, then the legislator will have to listen. So I can do things like run ads, or here's like you probably don't even remember this happening, but so PETA used to go to like fancy red carpet events and throw red paint or blood on people's like fur coats to like convince them that like it was bad. Anyway, I haven't had cable since Nate was born, so I don't literally have any idea what kind of commercials exist on television right now, but so maybe you can tell me some that are current. But right before Nate was born, I remember this was a BP oil spill. Remember that oil rig sort of disintegrated and then like it kept spewing oil because it was way underwater and we couldn't cap it, or it was really hard to figure out how to cap it. You guys remember that? So although normally oil and gas industry interest groups are pretty powerful, at that time they were really struggling because who in America was going to be like, yeah, I support the oil and gas industry? Nobody, right? People were really angry. It was like, wow, this is horrible. We should do something about it. So at that time, there was a lot of commercials on television that were run like by BP, British Petroleum, which was the company involved in the oil spill. Like they ran commercials about, look at all of the millions of dollars we're spending on cleanup efforts, and look how we're rebuilding communities, and look at all the green energy we're investing in. And they were like trying to be like, look how wonderful we are, don't hate us. And at the same time, like ExxonMobil ran some ads about like, look at all the millions of dollars we've invested in green energy, and look at all these new technologies we've developed that are helping other industries, and look at all the jobs we brought to the different areas that we have invested in. And the point was to help shape public opinion, because if the oil and gas industry wanted to be successful at the legislative level, they had to like not have the public hate them. And so they engaged in this opinion shaping effort to try to regain like a majority of people who would say, yeah, we support stuff for the oil and gas industry. So that's one great tactic. What else can an interest group do if they don't represent a majority, if they have a minority interest, if they're unpopular? Is there a branch of government that doesn't worry about being elected? That's right. So we can use litigation, right? So one of the biggest strategies of, especially in this case, racial minority groups, or other groups that face discrimination, like the LGBT movement, one of their best tactics for getting change is not going to Congress, because if you represent a minority, it's really hard to convince Congress to vote for you. But you can go to the courts, because theoretically, at least, the courts don't care about public opinion. And so if you can make a strong enough legal argument, then you can get the courts to take action on your behalf. So there are two ways that interest groups can influence the courts. The first way is they can actually sponsor litigation itself. So you might remember like the 1954 Brown v. Board case that was sponsored by the NAACP, right? So the NAACP, an interest group, they paid for the lawyers, they paid any court filing fees, they would help to pay for accommodations like for Linda Brown and her family, like when they had to come to testify or whatever. Like they covered all of those costs. Just recently, last year, the Washington versus Trump case over President Trump's, well, it's still going on kind of, over President Trump's executive order about immigration and refugees, that court case was funded by the ACLU. So the ACLU was the one who provided the lawyers and who was paying for whatever associated fees were necessary for that case. So that's one way, so they can actually sponsor litigation. But even if they're not actually sponsoring the litigation, we can also see interest groups take action how? There's that funny word again. They can write those amicus curiae briefs, right? So an amicus curiae brief is written by a lawyer. It's a legal document. It's complicated, you know, like it's not just like a letter to the editor, like here's what I think. It's written in very careful, measured legal language, and it says, here's what the case is about. We've read the case. Here's how we think you should interpret the law. Here's a whole bunch of precedents, other court cases that we think are relevant here, and here's why we think they're relevant, and here's why we think you should follow them. And here's how we think you should decide. So it's kind of like suggesting to the Supreme Court, here's how you could decide, here's how we interpret the law. Does the Supreme Court have to listen to amicus curiae briefs? No, so why write them?
You can hope.
How? Okay, you can hope. It could help. How could it help? When would that make a difference to the Supreme Court? Maybe if it's complicated, maybe if it's split. Well, I mean, almost all of their areas of interpretation, it has to do with numbers. One amicus curiae brief isn't going to change anything. But if we submit 100 amicus curiae briefs, or like if people submit 100 amicus curiae briefs, and 80 of them all suggest that the court finds in a particular way, the court can still disagree. But at the very least, it's helpful to the court. The court is going to take that information into account. Because remember, pretty much everything that goes to the Supreme Court is the gray area, right? It's not like there's a clear answer, this was legal or this was illegal. If it was that clear, it wouldn't have gotten to the Supreme Court. So it's all a question of interpretation. Well, maybe this counts, or maybe it's this thing. But those cases don't go, or those are the ones that the Supreme Court has to figure out. So looking at what these other legal scholars around the country, right, amicus curiae briefs aren't written by amateurs. They're written by important people who are lawyers and study the law. Looking at what these other people think will help the Supreme Court to kind of get a feel for what is the consensus, what does the legal community think about this case, and that can be pretty helpful. I have 5 minutes, right? Yes, okay, good. So we're almost finished then. So we know, of course, that interest groups can engage in electioneering. I'm not really going to spend much time here because I think your book covers it pretty well. This is not lobbying. How is electioneering connected to lobbying? Why would I want to help people get elected if my ultimate goal is to convince sitting politicians?
If you get people elected that already have similar values with what you want to do.
Okay, so we're happier when people who get elected are the ones who already like us. And the second half is access, right? It's a question of access. I'm going to be more successful getting a meeting or convincing a politician or getting my, hearing ready if the politician already knows me. So if I've donated to their campaign or helped their campaign in a big way, then that politician is likely to take my meeting. Hopefully not bribery. That would be illegal. But it helps to get access. So the only other thing I'm going to draw your attention to here, because again, this is in your book and it's pretty straightforward, right? It's just ways to help political parties, is that I included PACs last on the list. So PACs, the way we donate money, right? Or the interest groups donate money to campaigns. I included it last, not because it's not important, but because lots of times students get hung up on PACs and giving money, and they forget that electioneering is bigger than that. That interest groups do other things to affect elections besides just give money. So make sure you understand that it's sort of multifaceted. So then the last thing that I really wanted to talk about is just to remind you about some of those regulations that exist. The biggest one that exists to regulate interest groups is the Lobbying Disclosure Act. It was passed in the 90s. And you probably already know that it means that, the name suggests, that lobbyists have to disclose who they are and who they work for and who they're meeting with. And that all makes sense. There are some other rules of the Lobbying Disclosure Act, like there are significant financial limits. You can't spend more than, $50 or something on buying a Congress member's lunch or something. And you got to be careful. You can't take them on random trips to go play golf in Scotland. So there's rules about that. But the one that most students forget about is this last piece, the limits on revolving door appointments. So if we require lobbyists to register, then that allows us to regulate who can be a lobbyist, right? Because I can either allow you or deny you the right to register as a lobbyist. So when we require lobbyists to register, then we can say, listen, if you were a member of Congress in the last 5 years, you cannot register as a lobbyist. You can't come and try to influence. So why would we want to do that? Like, why would we want to limit the revolving door?
Because we don't want people to know the inner workings of like government or certain departments to go and then just like help watch like the filters.
Well, I mean, not quite, because, so what you're saying, we don't want them to know the inner workings. That's like it has to be a secret. I mean, we theoretically, American government should not be a secret, so that's not it. But there are no term limits. Well, that's why the interest groups want them. I'll help. It's the question of bribery. Let's say you're a legislator, you've been there for a couple of terms, you've usually voted for me, so I kind of like you already, but there's a big law coming up. I might say something like, hey, Representative Jennifer, we've always been really good friends. There's this big law coming up. I know it's going to be hard for you, but I would really love for you to vote our way on this. And hey, I really wanted you to know, if you ever get tired of Congress, you could always come and work for us. We've got this great position. We think you'd be perfect for it. You know Congress so well. I can pay you like $6 million a year. So just think about it. But, just thanks for being a great friend. Have a nice day. Well, what's happening? I mean, she can vote my way, even if it's against her constituents' wishes, and then retire comfortably to a very fancy, smancy job. And that's pretty corrupt, right? We don't like that. So that's why we want to avoid the revolving door. So fundamentally, that's all I have for you today. That's like the end of our unit. On Friday, we're going to do some review, and we'll be good to go.